It was a cool Saturday morning, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the corner cafe, lighting up the space with a warm, golden hue. The smell of espresso and baked pastries lingered in the air as quiet jazz music played in the background. People were spread out across the tables, some working on laptops, others in quiet conversation. The place had a vibe of calm productivity, a small oasis in the middle of a buzzing city. A man walked through the door, holding it open for the elderly woman behind him. He stepped into the cafe with quiet confidence, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, dark slacks, and polished brown shoes. His skin was smooth and dark, his beard trimmed and elegant. In his hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase, and under his arm, a thick book titled The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. He approached the counter with a slight nod to the barista, his voice calm and respectful as he placed his order. Medium dark roast, no sugar. And a warm butter croissant, please. The barista, a young woman with short hair and a nose ring, smiled and rang him up. She noticed the book under his arm and gave a small nod of appreciation. "One of my favorites," she said. He returned the smile. "It still has so much to teach," he replied. As he waited for his coffee, he glanced around the cafe. A group of college students laughed loudly near the window. A young couple held hands and sipped lattes. An older man dozed off next to his newspaper. The man selected a quiet corner seat near a bookshelf filled with donated reads. He settled in, pulled out a highlighter from his pocket, opened the book to a marked page, and began reading. The peace of the moment was disrupted when the front door opened abruptly, the bell above it jangling sharply. A middle-aged white woman stepped in, speaking loudly into her phone. "Well, I told her I wasn't paying that. It's ridiculous. She should know better than to mess with me." Her voice cut through the mellow air like a buzz saw. Dressed in a leopard print coat, oversized sunglasses, and clutching a designer purse, she walked straight to the counter, snapping her fingers at the barista. "Excuse me. I've been standing here for 30 seconds. Does no one serve paying customers anymore?" The barista blinked, caught between preparing a drink and responding. "I'll be with you in just a moment, ma'am." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically and muttered, "Unbelievable." She glanced around the cafe, clearly unimpressed. Her eyes landed on the man sitting in the corner. She paused for a moment. Something in her expression changed, curiosity, irritation, then judgment. He didn't notice her stare at first, he was underlining a passage with care. But she wasn't subtle. She stepped closer to his table and stared. He looked up, confused but polite. "Yes?" he asked, his tone neutral. "You don't look like you belong here," she said bluntly, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few heads turned. The barista froze, mid-pour. The man's expression didn't change, but he closed his book gently and placed it on the table. "And why is that?" he asked, calmly. "I just think it's odd. This is a nice place. People come here to relax, not be bothered," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" "Somewhere else?" he repeated. "Yes. I don't know. Maybe somewhere that fits your background," she said with a sneer. "Maybe back in Africa or wherever it is you're from." The cafe went silent. A spoon clattered onto the floor. A woman near the window gasped audibly. The man didn't react immediately. He let the words linger in the air, as if weighing them for their full meaning. He stood up slowly, not with aggression, but with a composed grace that made him seem taller. He looked directly at the woman, his eyes steady. "Are you done?" he asked, still calm. The woman looked a bit startled by his lack of emotion. "Excuse me. Are you done speaking to me like I don't have the right to exist in the same public space as you? Are you done assuming where I'm from, based on the color of my skin? Are you done humiliating yourself?" There was a beat of silence. The barista moved from behind the counter, concern on her face. One of the students pulled out their phone and began filming. The man took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice louder, not shouting but deliberate and clear. "I was born 3 blocks from here. I've lived in this city all my life. My great-grandfather helped build the subway you rode in on. My grandfather fought in a war so people like you could continue living freely, even if that meant dealing with hate when he came home in uniform. My mother was a schoolteacher for 30 years and taught hundreds of children, some of them probably grew up to serve people like you coffee. And me, I've got 2 degrees. I lecture on American history. I've spent years studying this country, its beauty, and its flaws. And let me tell you something, ma'am. He paused and took a sip of the coffee that the barista quietly placed on the edge of the table. You don't get to tell me where I belong. The woman opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but he raised a hand, not to silence but to finish his thought. I am not from Africa, although I would be proud if I were. I am from here. And whether you accept it or not, I am just as much a part of this country's story as anyone else. Actually, more than most, because I've had to fight for every piece of dignity that people like you try to take away. There was a long pause. The cafe remained quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the fridge behind the counter. The woman blinked rapidly, her expression tight. Well, I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, he said, without anger. You meant every word. You just didn't expect anyone to challenge you. You're not used to being called out. She stood there, unsure what to say. Her confident mask was beginning to crack. The people in the cafe watched, some nodding quietly in support, others simply stunned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult you. I didn't call you names. I responded with truth, not hate. That's the difference between you and me, he said. You walk in here thinking you own the place. I walk in here carrying the weight of centuries and still manage to smile. The woman looked around, as if seeking an ally, but no one met her eyes. The barista finally stepped forward and said, firmly, ma'am, I think it's time for you to leave. The woman's mouth fell open. Me? What about him? He's welcome here, the barista replied without hesitation. You are not. There was a brief moment of disbelief, then the woman huffed, grabbed her purse, and stormed toward the door. She paused just before exiting, perhaps hoping for one final word, one last sting. But the man had already turned back to his seat, opened his book, and resumed reading. As the door closed behind her, the cafe slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before. The tension slowly melted, replaced with something else, respect. A young man walked over to the table. Hey, sir, that was powerful. Thank you for saying what you said. The man nodded. Thank you for listening. The student hesitated, then asked, mind if I sit here? I'd like to hear more about that book. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Of course. Pull up a seat. A few minutes later, others began approaching. A young woman offered him a fresh pastry, on the house. A man left a sticky note on his table that read, you changed how I see things today. Someone else paid for his next coffee. Outside, the woman who had been kicked out stood fuming beside her car, but no one paid her any mind. The world had moved on without her anger. Inside, in that small cafe, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, but deeply. One voice had spoken truth. And a room full of people had heard it. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't. Because he chose wisdom over rage. Because he reminded everyone, through grace, that no one gets to decide who belongs, and that dignity, when rooted in history and truth, is stronger than hate. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed. Something intangible now filled the air, something heavier than silence and deeper than mere curiosity. The man's words still lingered like the final notes of a powerful song that leaves an audience too stunned to clap. A few people had approached his table after the confrontation, and even though he had returned to his book, their glances carried more weight than casual observation. They weren't looking at just another customer anymore. They were looking at someone who had stood up without raising his voice and, in doing so, reminded everyone of their responsibility, to see clearly, to listen deeply, and to stand when it mattered. The man, whose name was Elijah, sipped his lukewarm coffee and flipped through the next chapter of his book. He wasn't reading anymore. His eyes moved across the page, but his mind was still in that moment. He'd faced that kind of ignorance before, sometimes loud, sometimes subtle, but today felt different. It wasn't the woman's words that had affected him most. It was the crowd, the way they froze, the way no one spoke up before him, the way people watched like they were witnessing a scene from a film and didn't realize it was real. But even that didn't bother him. What stayed with him was the expression on a child's face. At the far corner of the room, there had been a family, 2 parents, their young daughter, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She'd been drawing with crayons, pink and blue streaks across a white page. When the woman had begun yelling, the girl had looked up and watched it all unfold. No blinking, no flinching, just wide-eyed observation, taking it all in with the kind of innocence that doesn't know how to lie to itself yet. When Elijah had spoken, the girl had leaned forward as though she were hearing a fairy tale. And when the crowd clapped, she didn't smile. She just looked at her mother, confused, and said, "Why did she say that to him?" That was the voice that played on repeat in Elijah's head, long after the noise had faded. Another patron walked over, an older white man with silver hair and a tremor in his hands. He gently placed a palm on the edge of Elijah's table. "Son, I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to go through that here." Elijah closed the book and met the man's eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "I saw things like that growing up," the man continued, his voice low. "Didn't always speak up like I should have. I thought I was a good person because I wasn't the one shouting." But silence, he trailed off, shaking his head. "Anyway, just wanted to say thank you. You taught something today, not just to her, to all of us." Elijah reached out and shook the man's hand. "It's never too late to stop being silent," he replied. The older man gave a nod, his eyes moist, and returned to his seat. Soon after, the young barista who had served Elijah earlier came back with another coffee, this one steaming. "On the house," she said. "And I just wanted to say that was probably one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed." Elijah looked up at her. "What's your name?" "Jas," she said. "Well, thank you, Jas. Not just for the coffee. For speaking up when you did." She shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "It's the least I could do. Maybe. But the least can still mean a lot." As she walked away, Elijah opened his book again. But this time, he didn't even pretend to read. He leaned back and watched people. Some avoided his gaze. Some nodded slightly when their eyes met his. Some looked as if they wanted to say something but weren't sure what or how. A man near the door was still typing furiously on his phone, probably posting the video online. Elijah didn't mind. The truth, when captured, had its own way of spreading. Then came the reporter. It wasn't even an hour after the woman had stormed out when a young man in a hoodie walked in with a camera in his hand. He wasn't flashy or pushy, but there was a certain energy in his step. He introduced himself quietly. "I run a local social justice blog. Someone sent me a clip of what happened. You mind if I ask you a few questions?" Elijah looked at the camera, then back at the man. "As long as this doesn't become a circus." "No, sir," the man said, sincere. "I just think what you said could help people." They sat down. The interview wasn't long. The reporter asked him about what happened, how he felt, and why he said what he said. Elijah's answers were thoughtful but measured. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He didn't want to become a symbol for something. He just wanted people to remember that dignity was not something to be granted, it was something to be recognized. "The truth is," Elijah said near the end, "I didn't plan to say anything. I was tired. I was looking forward to a quiet morning. But something about that moment, it just broke through the silence I've carried for years. I didn't shout. I didn't insult. I just told her who I am. And sometimes, that's enough to shake people." The reporter nodded. It definitely did. By late afternoon, the video had already begun circulating online. Views multiplied by the thousands. Comments poured in. Some were supportive, others defensive. Some denied what had happened at all. But many thanked Elijah for speaking truth to hate in a way that pierced deeper than anger ever could. He stayed at the cafe until early evening, accepting the company of strangers who came by one to thank him, offer stories, or simply sit near him. An Asian American woman shared how her father used to tell her never to talk back to racism because it would make things worse. But today, she said, you reminded me that not speaking is what makes it worse. A biracial teenager asked to take a picture with him and whispered, that was the first time I saw someone who looked like me win with words, not fists. An older black woman stood nearby, listening for a while before finally approaching. You remind me of my son, she said. He passed a few years ago. But he used to say the same thing you said. I am more American than your hate will ever be patriotic. When you said that, I felt like he was still here. Elijah bowed his head, emotion tightening his throat. Thank you, he said. It was all he could say. That night, he walked home in the dark. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, neon lights flickering, laughter from distant streets. But in his mind, he still heard the little girl's voice. Why did she say that to him? It wasn't a question of curiosity. It was a question born from a crack in innocence. Elijah knew that as that girl grew older, the world would give her more answers than she ever asked for. But if nothing else, today, she saw that you didn't have to scream to fight back. You didn't have to insult to push back. You didn't have to raise your fists to stand tall. When Elijah reached his apartment, his phone buzzed. Dozens of messages. Old classmates, colleagues, even a few strangers. One said simply, you made me see something today. He stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. The night was quiet now, and he finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened. He wasn't angry. He was tired. But he was also proud, not because he'd shut someone down, but because he'd spoken truth. And the truth, when spoken from a place of history, grace, and clarity, could shake even the deepest roots of hate. He closed his eyes and whispered softly, not to the city or to anyone watching, but to himself. I am not going anywhere. Not back to Africa. Not out of that cafe. Not away from truth. He belonged, fully, loudly, and unapologetically. And that was enough.